Jamie, welcome to the Grin Gets Real podcast. I am really excited to have you on here as we dive into just kind of being better at security and privacy as marketers. So welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
So let's dive into just kind of giving the audience a little bit of insight as to who you are, like what your area of expertise is, kind of your why. We don't have to start all the way back to elementary school, so just catch us up to your profession.
Yeah, sure. So my focus has always been in bringing communities together. And that has been in marketing for a long time, for over 20 years. I started building out white label social networks at the beginning of Web 2.0 in the mid-aughts. And then in the early 2010s, I moved into doing social strategy and digital marketing for a company called JanRain, which is in the identity and access management space. So at the time, social login was an important way to collect information about who your consumers are. And I helped really large brands that were using the JanRain software to integrate social components into their marketing efforts. So that would be companies like Warner Music Group. We ran Lady Gaga's a couple of album drops for her. Coca-Cola, we did the My Coke Rewards program. And over time, across the 2010s, I think our relationship with social media has gotten more complicated. And one of the reasons why is because of some of these security and privacy concerns. So about 2 years ago, I started a new company called Contxt that's focused on improving security and privacy for APIs in particular, for data in motion, because this consumer data is moving around so much. I ran marketing teams and programs for a long time, and I know this is a challenge because it requires a lot of expertise, but most marketers don't have a lot of exposure to the issues.
Yeah, well, and that's kind of what I want to really dig into today, because I think, in our previous conversation, we got real deep into like security, or it felt very deep into data and security. And one of my questions to you was like, all right, how do we make this digestible for marketers? Because part of that is also educating our customers on security and privacy. So we have to be experts, but we have to be able to break it down to our customers. How do you make this privacy and security, which sounds very sexy, digestible for consumers and also for marketers that don't really understand what we mean by that?
Yeah, I think we all know as marketers that we're in the business of building relationships with brands and relationships with companies. And I think when we talk about privacy and security, a lot of the time, what we're trying to do in digital is we're trying to turn, how we build relationships interpersonally, how you and I build trust, how we build trust with our friends and family. And we're trying to turn that into a set of rules that can be, sort of enforced, but also optimized in a digital context or in a machine to consumer context. So, the way I think about it is it's really a series of decisions that we make about how to respect customers, how to respect our consumers and the relationships that we're building, and do it in a way that scales. And, we've never had to deal with that interpersonally before. The, average human number of relationships that we can manage is like 150. And after that, we just don't deal with scale very well. But of course, our marketing efforts, we want them to scale. So we need some tools to help make that scale possible.
Absolutely. And then build our trust by protecting our consumers' privacy as marketers as well, too. What are some of the challenges that digital marketers are starting to face right now as it pertains to privacy and security?
Well, I think the challenges are myriad, right? There's a lot of shifts in the regulatory landscape. And, we can touch on those. But I think even before we talk about regulation, it starts with a changing perception amongst our customers. 5 years ago, The stock market looked very different. Social media companies looked very different.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of digital transformation initiatives were focused on how do we build as much understanding of the customer as possible. Those are great intentions, but something that has changed in the consumer's mind now is they don't really understand when they share data with us. They don't really understand what's happening to it,
Mm-hmm.
where it's going, how it's being used, what's inbounds and what's out of bounds. And as a customer, am I comfortable with that? And so a lot of the
Yeah.
regulation has been in response to those growing concerns that I don't know what's happening to my data, and I don't know, how to control, my relationship with this brand or with this business. So,
Yeah.
in response to that, now the EU has passed a privacy regulation called the GDPR. And one of the big results
Mm-hmm.
that we see from GDPR is that you see cookie consent banners everywhere. At the bottom of the screen, you have this pop-up that says, can we
Everywhere.
collect? Yeah, yeah. So this has been, the one big change that's really noticeable for the consumer is the experience got worse. Now I have to get these pop-ups out of my way before I can actually do what I wanted to. That's sort of, I would say, a version 0 of where we're trying to get to, but it's the start of a conversation. It's a pretty immature conversation at this point.
Yeah, what I think is really interesting too is that we as consumers live in this world where we we kind of want the digital world to revolve around us. Just serve me. And I think that we've almost been trained in that way from a social media perspective, right? The algorithm, like I love to talk about the TikTok algorithm, right? Because it knows what it is that I want to see. It continues to serve that up. I like that kind of customization, but do I want it to follow me everywhere? So I think that's kind of one of those challenges where we're talking about like, data and privacy and security. Yeah, I want to give you my data, but I want to control what type of data I'm giving you. So what is in the marketer's control? What kind of information and how are we asking for that information from our consumers so we can kind of start to build on that trust?
Yeah. I think, TikTok is a great example. Netflix is another great example. They'll give me, they
Yeah.
know 99% certain that I'm going to like this show. And so we've seen this evolution of products being much more personalized. And,
Yeah.
that's great on the product side of that conversation. The nice thing about that is we already have a relationship. So I want that personalization. I want the depth of,
Mm-hmm.
your insights about me and my interests to affect our relationship. A lot of the time though, marketers live, in the relationship building, not the relationship maintenance process, right? And a lot of that relationship
Yeah.
building, it's focused on advertising, and I think advertising, and the whole ad tech stack is built on making our best guess, making inferences, finding audiences, finding people who we think are going to share an affinity, but doing that in a way that still maintains some kind of anonymity. And, there's a lot of opportunity there, but there's
Yeah.
also some risk because, consumers now have the right to know what data you're collecting about me, where that data is being stored, who has access to that data. And then the consent, which is, the sort of the cookie banner version, is now what am I allowed to do with this information? Is it okay if I continue our
Yeah.
conversation on another website? That might be something that a lot of customers are fine with. And then there's some that might say, well, I don't think we know each other well enough yet. I use the analogy of dating a lot when it comes to privacy and security
Mm-hmm.
because we don't necessarily disclose everything about ourselves right away, and I like to say that you never ask somebody's salary on a first date. It's just, it's something that you have to earn the right to get that kind of disclosure. And while we're so good, I think, and so nuanced in doing that in a personal context, we sort of have either an on or off switch, a lot of the times when it comes to
Yeah.
marketing. Either you're totally anonymous or I want to know everything about you. And I think part of the answer is to build a relationship that grows and there's more data disclosure and there's more opt-in over time. And that's connected to value that the customer understands.
It does feel a little bit like a chicken and egg scenario, right? You want to be able to build trust, but I, as a marketer, am now thinking, okay, well, I want to build your trust, Jamie. I'm going to show you these ads with very little information about you, but I want you to keep coming back. So how do I do that without knowing really a ton about you, but still trying to provide value to you? What is that tightrope walk that a marketer can do to really gain that trust and at the forefront, right? Because you're right, it is not relationship maintenance. What I'm talking about when I talk about like the algorithm is to your point, like we already have this established relationship, we've built up the trust, but what as a marketer can I do? What's in my power to do as far as like a strategy to help build out that trust? What are some suggestions that you have?
Yeah. Well, I think it starts with where does the conversation begin in building that relationship? So I think about print media a lot and how print has sort of translated or been interpreted in digital. I used to have magazine subscriptions, and a magazine is just an affinity around a set of interests, right? So it gave the marketer some information about what content is going to make sense in this space. And I think we're starting to see a return to some of that alignment with affinity. It looks very different in digital, but we want audiences that are already primed to understand and care about some of our value propositions, right? That's where the conversation begins, where we're inserting ourselves into an existing community or an existing conversation, and we're saying, hey, we have something to contribute here. If you are aligned with us, then why don't you come over to one of our owned and operated channels and we'll continue that conversation. So that initial outreach, it can still be very anonymous. But what we want to do is we want to create a series of touch points then after that are going to deepen the relationship.
Yeah.
I think an extreme way of doing that is, okay, now you came to our website and, we want you to fill out a form with 100 characteristics about you and your interest and your background and your date of birth and all this information just to participate. I think instinctively we all know that that's not a great solution. But I think what's harder is to then peel off, when can I ask you for some information about yourself? And when can I offer something of value for you? And that's where I think a mature marketing team is spending their energy. They're testing those points. And what I like to say is, if you're providing 10x the value you're asking for in return, that's a good value exchange for anybody. So if you have really unique content, if you have trial offers, if you have examples or samples, if you have contests, those are all moments to say, okay, is this 10x? If it's what I'm offering 10x the value of what I'm asking? And if you can say yes, that becomes easy. And then you link those together. So, your first touch point is going to ask for a very modest amount of information. And then as the relationship builds, you could do special promotions, you could do special offers, but they're designed to create more value than they're asking for in return.
That makes sense. And I want to touch on one of the things that you said, because it reminded me of a previous conversation that we had. When you said contests. And I think as a marketer, when I hear privacy and security, my brain kind of always goes to like the cookie stuff that you're talking about, the third party, moving from third party to first party data. It's all of that stuff. But there are a lot of like nuanced things as well. And contests is a really good example, because I think that a lot of people are doing that on social media, right? Where we're collecting information. But one of the interesting things that you said was, when it comes to privacy and security, legislation is different across states. So especially in the United States, where we don't have GDPR, you can't necessarily do a nationwide contest. Could you just kind of dive into a little bit of that?
Yeah, it's a really emergent landscape right now. So there is privacy regulation moving forward in 36 state legislatures, and California was the first state to pass the CCPA, California Consumer Privacy Act. But now we have several other states that have passed laws. Montana, Kentucky is moving forward. Alaska is moving forward. it's privacy, improving privacy, especially in digital. It cuts across political ideology. It's a very universal, set of beliefs. So you see a number of states moving forward. Okay, so the nice thing about Europe is that they adopted one set of regulations for 26 member states. We don't get that in the US.
Yeah.
And what it means is that, there are some rights that are enshrined in these laws that are easy to understand. Like the customer has a right to know who you are, who is requesting this information about me. They have the right to access their data. They have the right to request that you erase that data. But in some states, there are certain things that consumers have rights to that are not so common or not so easy to understand. In California, they have a right to restrict the processing of that data. So that means that it's okay for my email tool to have this information about me, but I don't want you transferring that data to your ad retargeting stack. So at a data object level, they start to have some ability to control that. What that means is that your privacy policies have to consider those laws, and especially, we're talking about contests. It means that if you're asking for information, if you do an anonymous contest where anybody can enter to win without a lot of information, that's not an issue. But if all of a sudden you want to do retargeting, you want to build a relationship, which of course is the goal of any marketer, you have to start to look at maybe doing state level contests or regional contests that might not be open to everybody across the country. So it changes the way that you would, market that. It might change the customer experience. I think one of the safe options is that if there's some level of benefit that you can give everybody who enters a contest, then you could ask them for the information about themselves when they claim their reward. And maybe that reward is a very, sort of low level reward that everybody has access to. And then obviously you're not going to get the same level of data from that. Not everybody's going to opt into that, but it's also a good confirmation that what you're creating has some value, because, there's a lot of contests and offers where people just click on a button, they enter, they don't really care to have a relationship with you. And having somebody subscribe, then you're sending them a bunch of emails, then they unsubscribe and they were never going to convert anyway.
Yeah.
That's not the biggest success metric for our contests either.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I just think that that's really interesting because I've honestly never thought about like the state to state as you're running contests. And I think in the world of social media as well, too, like we're always trying to think of like the hook for people, right? If you're on social, I want to be able to advertise. That's why I wanted to just kind of dive into that, because I think when we think about privacy and security, that's not necessarily the thing that we're thinking about, but it really touches everything. Now, because we're on this subject, and I've already mentioned like this whole third party to first party, I'd love to hear what your take is on third party data providers, because of, everybody very focused on privacy and security. And that I think has to do with a lot of like the most recent and in the past data breaches. I think that there is this push to do kind of away with most third party providers, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Like, is there going to be this mass shift to just first party data to ensure that we have like good privacy and security, just kind of laws for consumers?
Yeah, I think you're going to see this reckoning continue over the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years. And at the end of it, I think it's going to be very difficult for any of the current third-party technologies to have a sustained approach, right? Yeah. So third-party cookies, they're already blocked by default in, a lot of browsers, in Safari, in Firefox, in Chrome more and more. Every iteration of Chrome gets slightly more restrictive, on that front. So the tools and the mechanisms that third parties have for collecting data is changing. What that means, though, is that data collection mechanisms are evolving so that I don't think third-party data opportunities go away, right? But they do change. And part of that change is that they are not going to be quite as valuable as they used to be. So there's sort of what's the market and how much should we be paying to get targeting that is less accurate. The opportunity to collect first-party data, as we've been discussing, it's a great opportunity, but it's also not simple. It takes sustained effort, and it takes a lot of incremental improvements in the customer relationship to get more data. So I don't think first-party data supplants third-party all the way. But what I do expect is that, for example, I think that there's going to be a lot of competition in the next 24 months over analytics tools. I mean, Google Analytics won that war, and it's free and everybody sort of deploys it by default. Well, now Google Analytics is pushing website owners to opt in and update to they call it GA version 4. It doesn't use cookies in the same way. And that's driven by these privacy regulations. And so I expect that we're going to see competition in the analytics space that we haven't seen for 15 years. Where all of a sudden, well, if I'm going to have to rip and replace my current Google Analytics installation with a new one, maybe there's a privacy preserving alternative that's free and open source, or maybe there's something that I'm willing to pay for because I'm going to get something that's much richer than the network that GA has been able to provide for us in the past. So I think that sort of underlying architecture of how you build and run your website and app, it's going to have to evolve, and it's an opportunity, I think, for us to make some conscientious choices about the tools that we're using.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And I really do love that you are very much so emphasizing the fact that we have to really start building and focusing on customer relationships, which, to your point, that takes a little bit longer. It takes a little bit longer, and there is a little bit much more. That's not proper English. There's a little more finesse that is required with that. And it's a lot more work on the marketer side of it as well, too. I would imagine that as a result of that, you can expect to see the window of ROI to be a little bit longer, or larger. Like it's going to take more time to get to that big return on investment, that with easier access to the data, I guess in theory, we get it a little bit faster, right? But if we're kind of holding out, if we're dating a little bit more before we move into each other, to use a dating analogy for you, before we move in together, like that's going to take more time, because you don't move into, you don't move in after 2 weeks unless you're on Love is Blind. But that's another story for another podcast. Now, I know that we've kind of talked about, like, in the next 24 months, what's going to happen in the future, but this is the true prediction time. I'd love to hear what you see kind of changing for digital marketers in the next year.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we already have some indication that the California Consumer Privacy Act is going to start having some teeth in the next 12 months because the way they fund that legislation is by creating a Data Protection Authority, a DPA. And that's a state level office. And their job is to levy fines for privacy violations. And what that means is they have to go out and start to look for violations that they can charge a fine against in order to stay in business, in order to fund their own office. So, the cost of privacy violation is going to go up, and it's going to start in California in the US, but it's not going to stop there. And the result of that is that I think we'll see a change in the ROI calculation of implementing appropriate privacy and security for our customers in the first place, and also checking to make sure that campaigns or systems that we've had running for years sometimes have the appropriate sort of infrastructure set up to be able to support some of these new rules and make it easy for consumers to get the information they now have a right to.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for coming on and just kind of sharing your knowledge, breaking it down a little bit for me especially, is because again, I think like when we talk about privacy and security, it is a really heavy topic, but it is really important, especially in this digital landscape that we're in. So thank you again for coming on here and just sharing your knowledge with us.
You bet. Thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun.